Siblings are often the people we grow up closest to. Even if there are disagreements along the way, there is usually an understanding that when it truly matters, they will stand by each other. It's a bond that most of us take for granted. If you were asked, you might even say that there is very little you wouldn't do for your brother or sister. But what happens when that loyalty is tested in a way few could ever imagine? On February the 2nd, 1933, in the quiet French city of Le Mans, that question took on a far darker meaning. What began as an ordinary evening inside a respectable household would soon become one of the most unsettling cases in the country's history. At the center of it were two sisters, Christine and Léa Papin. To those who knew them, they were quiet, hard-working, and largely unnoticed. They lived a routine life, one that blended into the background of the home they worked in. There was nothing outwardly remarkable about them, nothing that would suggest their names would one day be remembered far beyond the walls of that house. And yet, on that night, something happened. Something that would leave people searching for answers. Something that would be discussed, debated, and examined for years to come. And something that continues to raise the same uneasy question. How far can loyalty really go? Because what these two sisters did that evening was not just unexpected, it was something very few could have ever predicted. And to understand how it happened, we have to begin long before that night. Welcome back. Before we dive in, take a moment to comment your time and location. I always find it fascinating to see where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. Because tonight's case, set in France in 1933, is one that still raises questions to this day. To understand what happened in 1933, it's important to look much earlier, to a household where stability was already beginning to slip away. Christine and Léa Papin were born into a family that, from the outside, may have seemed ordinary. But behind closed doors, there were tensions that had been building long before either of them could understand them. Their parents, Clémence Desrets and Gustave Papin, had a troubled relationship almost from the very beginning. There were rumors surrounding Clémence, whispers that she had been involved with her employer before marriage. Whether true or not, those suspicions stayed with Gustave. They created a quiet but persistent strain that never truly went away. In 1902, their first daughter, Emilia, was born. But rather than bringing stability, the years that followed only deepened the cracks. The relationship between Clémence and Gustave became increasingly difficult, shaped by mistrust, emotional distance, and personal struggles on both sides. Clémence was often described as emotionally unstable, struggling to cope with the demands of family life. Gustave, meanwhile, developed a reliance on alcohol that only added to the tension within the home. In 1905, their second daughter, Christine, was born, but instead of being raised by her parents, she was sent to live with relatives not long after her birth. For several years, she grew up away from the environment that was slowly deteriorating back home. Then, in 1911, their youngest daughter, Léa, was born. By this point, whatever remained of the marriage was beginning to fall apart. The household had become a place of instability, where conflict and emotional strain were no longer occasional. They were constant. Eventually, the relationship between Clémence and Gustave came to an end, but the damage had already been done. The three sisters had entered the world under very different circumstances, but they all shared one thing in common. They were growing up in the shadow of a family that had never truly been secure. And this was only the beginning. As the Papin family continued to unravel, the lives of the three sisters began to move in very different directions, not by choice, but by circumstance. The first to be removed from the home was Emilia. While still young, she was sent to the Bon Pasteur Catholic Orphanage in Le Mans, an institution known for its strict discipline and structured way of life. It was a place where routine replaced comfort, and obedience was expected above all else. Not long after, Christine was also taken from the relatives she had been living with and placed into the same orphanage. The reason for this decision remains unclear, but it marked a turning point. Any sense of stability she may have found growing up away from her parents was now replaced with a far more rigid environment. At first, Léa remained elsewhere, living with her mother's brother, but when he passed away, she too was sent to Bon Pasteur, joining her sisters within its walls. By this point, all three girls had been placed into institutional care, a situation that, while difficult, was not entirely uncommon at the time. In certain parts of France, a significant number of children were raised in similar conditions, often due to financial strain or family instability. Life inside the orphanage followed a strict routine. Days were structured, responsibilities were clear, and emotional expression was limited. It was an environment built on discipline rather than warmth, where personal identity often gave way to order and expectation. Over time, the paths of the sisters began to separate once again. Emilia, the eldest, chose to remain within that world. She entered religious life, taking her vows and committing herself to the convent, a decision that would permanently distance her from her family. But Christine and Léa did not follow that path. Instead, they would eventually leave the orphanage behind, and while they did, not remain there. The experience itself, the silence, the structure, the absence of comfort, had already left its mark. Because environments like this do not simply shape routines, they shape people. And for Christine and Léa, that influence would follow them long after they stepped outside those walls. By the time they reached their mid-teens, Christine and Léa Papin left the orphanage behind and entered a new phase of life, one that was common for young women in France at the time. At around the age of 15, they were sent into live-in domestic service. Their mother, Clémence, had a clear intention. Rather than supporting her daughters directly, she expected them to work and contribute financially. And so, one by one, the sisters were placed into households where their role was simple: to clean, cook, and maintain order, often while living under the same roof as their employers. From the beginning, differences between the two sisters were noticeable. Christine was known to be capable and efficient. She worked hard and took pride in her responsibilities, though there were moments when she could be firm, even resistant, if she felt something was unfair. Léa, on the other hand, was much quieter. She followed instructions without question, rarely spoke unless spoken to, and kept to herself. Where Christine showed signs of independence, Léa showed obedience. Despite these differences, one thing became increasingly clear. Whenever possible, the sisters asked to be placed together. Work placements did not always allow for it, and because Clémence often pushed for better wages, the sisters moved between employers more than once. But each time an opportunity came up, they chose to remain side by side, and over time, something began to form. Having grown up in unstable conditions, with little consistency and few reliable relationships, Christine and Léa became that constant for each other. In homes that were not their own, surrounded by people they served rather than belonged with, they turned inward, toward each other. Their connection strengthened quietly. There were no dramatic moments, no defining event that marked its beginning. Instead, it developed gradually, thus rough shared routines, shared spaces, and shared isolation. They spent their free time together, spoke to each other when no one else was listening, and relied on one another in ways that went beyond simple companionship. By the mid-1920s, that bond was firmly in place. So when in 1926, a new opportunity presented itself, one that offered stability, better conditions, and the chance to remain together, the sisters took it. And for a time, it would seem as though everything was finally beginning to settle. In 1926, Christine Papin secured a position that at first seemed like a turning point. The job was at 6 Rue Bruyère in Le Mans, in the home of René Lancelin, a retired solicitor. He lived there with his wife, Madame Léonie Lancelin, and their daughter Geneviève. It was a respectable household, orderly, well-maintained, and far removed from the instability Christine and Léa had grown up with. Christine began working there alone. From the beginning, her work stood out. She was efficient, reliable, and attentive to detail, qualities that did not go unnoticed. Over time, she built a level of trust within the household, and after several months, she made a request. She asked for her sister Léa to join her. The Lancelins agreed. With that, the sisters were reunited under one roof once again, and this time, the conditions were different. They were given a shared room with 2 beds, heating, and even access to a small balcony. They ate the same meals as the family and were paid standard wages for their work. Compared to their previous placements, it was a stable and comfortable environment. And the sisters adapted quickly. Their work remained consistent, and their dedication became something others noticed. In fact, it was said that households in similar social circles admired the Lancelins for having such dependable staff. But beyond the work itself, something else began to take shape. For the first time in their lives, Christine and Léa experienced a sense of structure that did not feel temporary. The household ran on routine, expectations were clear, and at least in the beginning, there was a level of fairness in how they were treated. Over time, their relationship with Madame Léonie Lancelin began to shift. She became more than just an employer. In a way that reflected what had been missing for most of their lives, she took on the role of a maternal figure, the Esther. Esters began referring to her as Maman, a quiet but telling detail. In contrast, their own mother, Clémence, was spoken of only as that woman. There was even a point when Madame Lancelin contacted Clémence directly, making it clear that the sisters would now keep their wages rather than sending money back home. For Christine and Léa, this was something new, a degree of independence they had never truly had before. For a time, it seemed as though they had finally found a place where things could remain steady, a place where life made sense, and perhaps a place where everything might finally stay that way. For several years, life inside the Lancelin household remained steady. The routine was familiar, the expectations were clear, and for Christine and Léa, that sense of structure had become something they depended on. But around 1932, subtle changes began to appear. At first, they were easy to overlook. Madame Léonie Lancelin, who had once been warm and approachable, began to withdraw. Conversations became shorter. Instructions that were once given in person were now written down. Notes replaced direct interaction, and the distance between employer and servant quietly grew. It wasn't sudden. It was gradual, but it was noticeable. Along with that distance came a shift in expectations. The standards within the household became stricter, more exact. Tasks that had once been accepted without comment were now inspected closely. It was said that Madame Lancelin would check surfaces carefully, ensuring that even the smallest detail had not been missed. Nothing could be out of place, and when it was, her reactions began to change. What may have once been simple correction turned into sharp criticism. Her tone grew harsher, her patience thinner. Small mistakes no longer passed unnoticed. They were met with frustration that seemed to build over time. For Christine and Léa, the change was difficult to ignore. The woman they had come to see as a maternal figure was no longer the same. The sense of comfort that had defined their early years in the household began to fade, replaced by something far less certain. And yet, their situation did not change. They remained in the same home, under the same expectations, carrying out the same duties. But the atmosphere around them had shifted, becoming tense in ways that were not always spoken, but clearly felt. Once again, the sisters found themselves in a familiar position, working, adapting, and keeping to themselves. And as before, they turned inward, relying only on each other. There was no outward sign of what this pressure might lead to, no clear moment where everything changed at once. Instead, it built slowly, quietly, until the kind of tension that had no release began to demand one. And on February the 2nd, 1933, that pressure would finally break. On Thursday, February the 2nd, 1933, the day began much like any other inside the Lancelin household. There was no indication, at least at first, that anything unusual was about to happen. At this point, Christine Papin was 27 years old, and her younger sister Léa was 21. Both had settled into their roles within the home, carrying out their duties with the same routine they had followed for years. That morning, the house was quiet. Madame Léonie Lancelin and her daughter Geneviève had gone out, leaving the sisters to manage the household on their own. Later that evening, the family had plans to dine with René Lancelin's brother, who lived nearby. For Christine and Léa, this meant something small but noticeable. They could work without being observed, without the constant presence that had in recent months become a source of tension. The atmosphere inside the house was different, calmer, more manageable. They moved through their tasks as usual, cleaning, organizing, preparing. At some point during the day, Christine turned her attention to one of her regular responsibilities, ironing the household's clothing. Earlier, a faulty iron had been sent for repair, and that morning she had collected it from an electrician. Now, believing it to be fixed, she plugged it in and switched it on. Almost immediately, the power failed. The house was left in darkness. It was an inconvenience, but not an urgent one. The sisters reasoned that the issue could be addressed later. With the family expected to be out for the evening, there seemed to be no immediate need to resolve it, so they continued with their work. But plans do not always unfold as expected. At some point before heading to dinner, Léonie and Geneviève returned home. Their arrival was unplanned, and as they entered the house, the absence of light would have been immediately noticeable. A conversation followed. Christine attempted to explain what had happened, the iron, the power failure, the decision to leave it until later. But instead of being received calmly, her explanation was met with anger. The tone shifted quickly. What had begun as an ordinary day, shaped by routine and familiarity, was no longer steady. Something had changed. And within moments that change would lead to something far more serious. What followed happened quickly. The conversation between Christine and Madame Lancelin did not remain calm for long. The frustration that had been building over months surfaced almost immediately, and the tone of the exchange changed from explanation to confrontation. Voices were raised. Tension, which had once remained beneath the surface, was now fully present. At some point during that exchange, Christine reacted first. Within reach was a heavy household object. In a moment that seemed to arrive without warning, she picked it up and struck out. That action changed everything. There was no pause, no return to calm. It was, in every sense, the point of no return. Hearing the disturbance, Geneviève moved to intervene. She stepped in, attempting to separate the situation, but instead became part of it. What had begun as a confrontation between two people quickly expanded into something far more chaotic. In the middle of this, Christine turned to Léa. She gave her an instruction, and Léa followed it. As she had done so many times before, she did not question it. She acted. From that moment on, the two sisters moved together. What followed was no longer a single reaction, but a sequence of actions that unfolded rapidly. The situation escalated beyond control, driven not by a single decision, but by a momentum that continued to build. At some point, items from the kitchen were brought into the situation, tools that should have remained ordinary, now used in a way they were never intended for. Time passed, longer than one might expect. The intensity of the moment did not fade quickly. Instead, it carried on, sustained by the same force that had triggered it. But eventually, it stopped. The movement ceased. And the house, which had only moments before been filled with noise, fell silent. What came next was not panic. There was no attempt to run, no immediate effort to escape what had just taken place. Instead, the sisters moved with a kind of calm. They secured the house, ensuring the doors were locked. They returned upstairs to their room, removed their clothing, and cleaned themselves. Then together they got into bed, and they waited. for what would come next. Because whatever had happened in those moments, it was not something that could be undone. And soon it would no longer remain contained within the walls of that house. At around 7 p.m. that evening, René Lancelin returned home. From the outside, nothing immediately seemed unusual. The house stood as it always did, but as he approached, one detail became clear. It was completely dark. At first he assumed his wife and daughter had already left for dinner and simply had not returned yet. With that in mind, he made his way to his brother's home, expecting to find them there. But they weren't. Now concerned, René returned to 6 Rue Bruyère. This time something felt wrong. The house remained dark, and when he tried the door, he found it locked from the inside. Unable to enter, he contacted the police. When officers arrived, they forced their way into the house. What they discovered inside would quickly confirm that something serious had taken place. On the second floor, there were clear signs of a violent struggle. The scene was disordered, and it was immediately evident that the situation was not an accident. In those first moments, there was even uncertainty about what had happened to the two maids, whether they had fled or whether they too had been harmed. The officers moved through the house, eventually reaching the sisters' room. The door was locked. A locksmith was called, and once the door was opened, they found Christine and Léa Papin inside, lying together in bed. They were calm. There was no attempt to deny what had happened. When questioned, the sisters confessed immediately. Their explanation was simple. They claimed it had been an act of self-defense. And when asked directly, Christine is reported to have said, "It was her or us." As news of the case spread, it did not remain confined to Le Mans for long. The story began to circulate across France, drawing attention not only because of what had happened, but because of how it was being interpreted. Surprisingly, there were those who expressed sympathy for the sisters. So, me viewed the case through a broader lens, as an example of the tension between domestic workers and the households they served. Others saw it as something more complex, shaped by environment, circumstance, and the lives the sisters had lived up to that point. Writers and thinkers began to discuss it. Debate followed. And as the story moved beyond the walls of that house, one question began to take hold. Why had this happened? That answer, however, was far from simple, and it would now be examined in a courtroom. When the case reached the courtroom, much of the focus shifted from what had happened to why. Throughout the proceedings, both Christine and Léa Papin remained notably calm. There was little outward emotion. Christine at times appeared distant, almost disengaged from what was taking place around her. Léa, as before, was quiet and withdrawn, speaking only when necessary. It was in this setting that their relationship began to draw closer attention. Observers noted a clear dynamic between the two. Christine appeared to take the lead, while Léa followed. This was not something new, but within the context of the case, it became a central point of discussion. Further details added to that picture. It was revealed that the sisters had managed to save 23,000 francs, a considerable amount at the time, far more than their combined annual earnings. Yet despite this, they had made little use of it. They did not travel, did not seek out entertainment, and did not spend their time outside of work exploring the world around them. Instead, they remained largely isolated. Most of their time was spent together. The defense built its case around this background. They pointed to the instability of the sisters' upbringing, the difficulties within their family, and the conditions they had lived under for much of their lives. From this, a psychological explanation was introduced. Experts suggested that the sisters may have been experiencing what is known as folie à deux, a shared condition in which two closely connected individuals influence each other's thoughts and behavior. In simple terms, one personality can begin to dominate, while the other follows, reinforcing the same beliefs and reactions. It offered a possible explanation, but it did not determine the outcome. After deliberation, the court found both sisters legally sane and guilty. The sentences reflected the perceived difference in their roles. Léa was given 10 years of hard labor, with the understanding that she had acted under her sister's influence. Christine, however, received a far harsher sentence, death, later commuted to life imprisonment. After the trial, the sisters were separated, and it was then that the extent of their dependence became clear. Christine's condition began to deteriorate. Without Léa, she became increasingly unstable, eventually refusing to eat. Despite efforts to care for her, her health continued to decline. On May 18, 1937, she died. Léa, by contrast, served a reduced sentence of around 8 years before being released. She went on to live quietly under a different identity, avoiding public attention for the rest of her life. In the end, the case left behind more questions than answers. Was it the result of environment, of isolation, of a bond that had grown too strong, without anything to balance it? There is no single explanation that fully accounts for what happened. Only a series of events, and 2 sisters whose lives became permanently defined by one night. And even now, the question remains, how far can loyalty really go?